England in 1825 stood at the precipice of social transformation, yet the aristocracy clung to traditions as immutable as the stones of their ancestral estates. The Industrial Revolution thundered through the northern counties, bringing unprecedented wealth to merchant families while threatening the ancient supremacy of landed nobility. In the grand drawing rooms of Mayfair, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across polished marble floors imported from Italian quarries, the rigid hierarchy of the peerage remained absolute and unforgiving. Dukes commanded respect with mere glances, their authority derived from centuries of royal favor and vast estates that stretched across multiple counties. Marquises wielded influence through whispered conversations in exclusive gentlemen's clubs, their political machinations shaping parliamentary votes and foreign policy. Even the lowest baron could destroy a reputation with a single raised eyebrow, such was the power of social ostracism in a world where acceptance meant everything and exile meant spiritual death. The morning sun filtered through the tall Georgian windows of Pemberton Manor, illuminating dust motes that danced like secrets in the air. Lady Margaret Thornfield sat at her escritoire, a delicate piece of mahogany inlaid with mother-of-pearl that had once graced her father's London townhouse, her fingers trembling as she sealed another letter with crimson wax. The seal bore her family crest, a phoenix rising from flames. How prophetic that seemed now, considering how she had risen from the ashes of her former life to create something entirely new. Her modest drawing room, though elegant in its simplicity, paled in comparison to the grand salons she once frequented, where powdered footmen served champagne on silver salvers and ladies competed with increasingly elaborate gowns of silk and satin. The wallpaper, a delicate pattern of roses and ivy hand-painted by local artisans, had begun to fade at the edges, much like her connection to the world she once knew. The morning light revealed every imperfection, every sign of genteel poverty that she had learned to accept as the price of independence and peace. 8 years had passed since she fled London society, carrying within her womb the greatest secret of her life. 8 years of exile in the countryside of Yorkshire, where rolling hills stretched endlessly toward horizons that promised nothing but anonymity. The local gentry knew her as the widow Mrs. Thornfield, a woman of modest means who had retired to the country after her husband's supposed death in the Peninsula Wars. They respected her quiet dignity, admired her devotion to her young son, and never questioned the delicate gold locket she wore constantly at her throat. Margaret rose from her desk, her morning dress of deep blue wool rustling softly as she moved to the window. The fabric, though well made, lacked the luxurious silks and imported velvets she once wore without thought. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman still beautiful at 28, though lines of worry had begun to trace themselves around her green eyes. Her auburn hair, once styled elaborately by ladies' maids, now fell in simple waves she arranged herself each morning. In the garden beyond, 8-year-old Thomas played with wooden soldiers, his dark hair catching the sunlight as he moved the figures across an imaginary battlefield carved into the soft earth beneath an ancient oak tree. The child possessed an unconscious nobility in his bearing that no amount of rustic upbringing could diminish, a legacy written in his very bones by generations of aristocratic breeding. His features, sharp and aristocratic even at such a tender age, would have betrayed his parentage to anyone familiar with the noble houses of England. The aquiline nose that would become more pronounced with maturity, the high cheekbones that spoke of Norman ancestry, the intelligent gray eyes that seemed to hold depths far beyond his years, all marked him as unmistakably noble despite his humble country clothing. The way he held his small shoulders straight when arranging his toy armies, the imperious tilt of his chin when concentrating on military strategy, the unconscious grace with which he moved, these were the hallmarks of generations of ducal breeding, traits that surfaced despite Margaret's careful attempts to raise him as a simple country gentleman's son. The sound of hoof-beats on the gravel drive shattered Margaret's reverie. Her heart clenched with familiar fear as she recognized the approaching carriage, black lacquer gleaming, brass fittings polished to perfection, and bearing the unmistakable coat of arms of the Duke of Ravensworth. After 8 years of hiding, 8 years of building a life in the shadows, the past had finally found her. The carriage door opened with mechanical precision, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat as a tall figure emerged. Alexander Blackwood, the 5th Duke of Ravensworth, stood in her modest courtyard like a dark angel descended from the heights of power. Time had only enhanced his commanding presence, his shoulders broader beneath his impeccably tailored coat, his face more angular, marked by the weight of ducal responsibilities. His black hair, longer than fashion dictated, caught the morning breeze as his steel-gray eyes surveyed the property with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to owning everything he saw. Thomas had frozen in his play, wooden soldiers forgotten as he stared at the magnificent stranger. The child's instinctive reaction spoke to something deeper than mere curiosity, recognition, perhaps, though he could not name it. Margaret watched in growing horror as Alexander's gaze fell upon her son, saw the exact moment when understanding blazed across his aristocratic features. The resemblance was undeniable, the same strong jaw, the same piercing eyes, the same air of natural authority that marked the Blackwood bloodline. Margaret's hands pressed against the window glass, leaving foggy prints as she struggled to breathe. 8 years of careful planning, 8 years of creating a new identity, 8 years of protecting her son from a world that would never accept him, all of it crumbling in the space of a heartbeat. The Duke had found them, and with him came the full weight of English society's judgment, the complex web of honor and reputation that could destroy or elevate a person with equal ease. The servants' quarters of Pemberton Manor held secrets of their own. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, had served Margaret faithfully since their arrival in Yorkshire, never questioning her mistress's past or the mysterious circumstances of her son's birth. The woman possessed the rare gift of absolute loyalty, understanding that some stories were better left untold. In the kitchen, cook prepared the midday meal with hands that had once served in grand London households, her silence purchased not with gold but with genuine affection for the woman who had given her a home when scandal made her unemployable elsewhere. The local village of Millbrook had embraced Mrs. Thornfield and her son with the warmth typical of rural communities. The rector's wife invited her to tea, the physician's daughter sought her advice on London fashions, and the landed gentry included her in their modest social gatherings. Yet Margaret always maintained a careful distance, never allowing friendships to deepen beyond polite acquaintance, never sharing details that might reveal the truth of her identity or the circumstances that had brought her to their quiet corner of England. Alexander Blackwood stepped across the threshold of Pemberton Manor with the unconscious authority of a man born to command. The modest entrance hall, with its simple oak paneling and single landscape painting, seemed to shrink in his presence. His greatcoat, removed by a nervous parlour-maid, revealed the epitome of Savile Row tailoring, a coat of midnight blue superfine wool, fitted to perfection across his broad shoulders, paired with cream-colored breeches and boots polished to mirror brightness. A single sapphire glinted in his carefully arranged cravat, the only concession to ostentation in an outfit that spoke of wealth so profound it required no advertisement. Margaret descended the staircase with measured steps, her spine straight despite the trembling in her hands. She had hastily changed into her finest remaining gown, a creation of emerald silk that had once graced ballrooms but now served as armor against the judgment she knew was coming. The dress, though several seasons old, still possessed the cut and quality that marked it as the work of London's finest modistes. Her hair, swept into an elegant chignon, revealed the graceful line of her neck and the simple pearl earrings that were her only remaining jewelry of any value. The drawing room where they faced each other had been transformed by Alexander's presence. What moments before had seemed a comfortable country retreat now appeared shabby and provincial. The faded roses on the wallpaper seemed to wilt under his scrutiny, the worn Persian carpet betrayed its age, and the modest furnishings spoke of genteel poverty rather than chosen simplicity. Yet Margaret held her ground, drawing upon reserves of dignity she had cultivated through years of necessary deception. Alexander's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the cultured tones of Eton and Oxford, tempered by years of addressing Parliament and commanding respect from his peers. "Lady Margaret Wyndham," he said, using her true name like a weapon. "Or do you prefer the more rustic Mrs. Thornfield?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp with accusation and something deeper, a pain that years of aristocratic training could not entirely suppress. The use of her real name struck Margaret like a physical blow. Lady Margaret Wyndham, daughter of the Earl of Ashford, had died in scandal 8 years ago, leaving behind only whispered rumors and a reputation in ruins. The woman who stood before the Duke now had been forged in the fires of exile, tempered by years of solitude and the fierce protectiveness of motherhood. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "I had hoped never to see you again." Alexander's laugh held no warmth, only the bitter edge of a man who had carried the weight of betrayal for nearly a decade. "I imagine you did. 8 years, Margaret. 8 years of believing you were dead, of mourning what I thought we had shared." His grey eyes swept the modest room, taking in every detail that spoke of her reduced circumstances. 8 years while you lived in comfortable obscurity, raising my son. The words hung between them like a challenge. Margaret's chin lifted with the pride that no amount of adversity could diminish. "He is my son," she said quietly. "I carried him, bore him in pain and secrecy, and raised him with love you could never understand. Your contribution was a single night of passion that you discarded with less thought than you give to choosing your morning cravat." The accusation struck home, and for a moment, the Duke's composure cracked. Alexander moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the garden where Thomas continued his solitary play. The child had inherited not only the Blackwood features but their bearing. Even at 8 years old, he commanded his toy soldiers with an unconscious authority that spoke of noble blood. "He has my eyes," Alexander said softly, and Margaret heard in his voice a wonder that belied his harsh words. Margaret joined him at the window, maintaining careful distance between them. "He has your stubbornness as well, and your intelligence. He reads voraciously, speaks French and Latin, and shows an aptitude for mathematics that astounds his tutors." She paused, watching her son with the fierce love that had sustained her through years of isolation. "He believes his father died a hero's death fighting Napoleon." It seemed kinder than the truth. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. "The truth? What truth is that, Margaret? That I was given no choice in any of this? That you disappeared without a word, leaving me to believe you had chosen another over me?" His voice carried the weight of years of unanswered questions, of nights spent wondering what he had done to drive her away. "I searched for you. God help me, I hired investigators, sent agents across England and the continent. I believed you were dead because the alternative, that you had chosen to vanish, was unbearable." Margaret turned to face him fully, her green eyes blazing with years of suppressed fury. "Choice. You speak of choice when you were announced to be engaged to Lady Vivian Ashworth a mere week after our night together. When the morning papers proclaimed your upcoming nuptials while I was still carrying the scent of your cologne on my skin." Her voice broke slightly, betraying the pain she had carried like a secret wound. "I was 17 years old, Alexander. 17 and naive enough to believe that passion meant love, that one night in your arms made me special rather than simply convenient." The engagement announcement, Alexander's face went white as memory crashed over him like a cold wave. His father, the fourth Duke, had arranged the match without consultation, presenting it as a fait accompli designed to secure the family's financial position and political influence. Alexander had fought against it, raged and threatened, but ducal duty had demanded submission to paternal will. "I broke that engagement," he said quietly. 2 months later, I broke it. But by then, you had vanished completely. Margaret's bitter laugh echoed in the modest room. 2 months too late. By then, I was showing, disgraced, and my father had sent me away to avoid scandal. Your engagement may have ended, but the damage to my reputation was irreversible. I became a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms, the Earl's daughter who threw herself at a duke and paid the price for her presumption. The weight of misunderstanding settled between them like a heavy curtain. Alexander's shoulders sagged slightly as the full scope of their tragedy became clear. 2 young people, caught in the machinations of ambitious families and the rigid expectations of society, had paid the price for a system that valued reputation over happiness, duty over love. Yet beneath the pain and recrimination, something else stirred, a recognition of the bond they had shared, the passion that had created the remarkable child playing in the garden beyond. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Persian carpet as Margaret and Alexander faced the impossible complexity of their situation. 8 years of separation had not diminished the electric awareness that sparked between them, though both fought against its pull with the desperation of survivors clinging to wreckage. The drawing room seemed to shrink around them, intimate despite the careful distance they maintained, charged with the memory of touches that had created more than passion, they had created a life. Alexander moved with restless energy, his tall frame dominating the modest space as he paced before the marble fireplace. His movements carried the unconscious grace of a man trained from birth in the arts of a gentleman, fencing, riding, dancing, yet beneath the polished exterior, Margaret could see the tension that vibrated through him like a tightly wound spring. When he finally stopped, his gray eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I must know everything," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his demands met. "How you survived, where you went, how you managed alone with a child." His gaze softened almost imperceptibly. "I must know if you suffered, if he suffered, because of my failure to protect you both." Margaret settled herself in the brocade armchair that had been her refuge during countless lonely evenings, her hands smoothing the emerald silk of her skirts with unconscious nervousness. The gesture drew Alexander's attention to the changes 8 years had wrought. Her hands, once soft and pampered, now bore the subtle calluses of a woman who had learned to work for her living. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band that proclaimed her fictional widowhood, caught the afternoon light and served as a reminder of the deception that had become her survival. "When my father learned of my condition," she began, her voice steady despite the pain of memory, "he flew into such a rage that the servants feared for his heart. I was his only child, his heir through marriage alliance, and I had destroyed myself for what he called a moment's folly with a libertine duke." The words carried the bitter edge of a wound that had never properly healed. "He gave me 2 choices, a hasty marriage to his elderly steward son, who would claim the child as his own, or exile with a modest annual sum that would cease upon his death." Alexander's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tightening with suppressed fury. "And you chose exile rather than security." It was not a question but a statement that revealed his growing understanding of the woman Margaret had become, strong, principled, willing to sacrifice comfort for independence. "I chose freedom," Margaret corrected quietly. "Freedom to raise my son without lies, without shame, without the constant fear that his true parentage would be discovered and used against him." She rose from her chair, moving to the small escritoire where family miniatures stood in silver frames. One showed Thomas at age 5, his dark hair tousled and his gray eyes bright with mischief. "I told him his father was a soldier who died fighting for England, a hero worthy of respect and remembrance." It seemed kinder than the truth. The accusation in her words struck deep, but Alexander pressed forward with the relentless pursuit of understanding. "Where did you go? How did you survive those first months?" His voice betrayed a vulnerability that years of ducal training had not entirely suppressed, a need to know that she had not suffered beyond bearing while he lived in ignorant comfort. Margaret's fingers traced the frame of Thomas's miniature as she spoke. My mother's sister, Lady Beatrice Thornfield, had married a merchant's son and been cut from the family for her presumption. She lived quietly in Bath, accepted in local society but forgotten by the ton. When I appeared on her doorstep, heavy with child and desperate, she took me in without question. The memory brought both gratitude and grief to her voice. She died when Thomas was 2 years old, leaving me her modest fortune and the identity of her widowed daughter-in-law. Mrs. Thornfield was born from necessity and kindness. The revelation of Margaret's struggle stirred something protective and possessive in Alexander's chest. The image of her, young and frightened, carrying his child through the unfamiliar world of provincial society, awakened feelings he had spent years suppressing. You should have come to me, he said roughly. Engagement or no engagement, I would have protected you, provided for you both. Margaret turned from the miniatures to face him, her green eyes blazing with the fire that had first captured his attention in a London ballroom nearly a decade ago. Come to you. The Duke of Ravensworth, engaged to the daughter of a marquis, with a reputation to protect and a ducal line to secure. I was 17 and foolish, but not so foolish as to believe a duke would sacrifice his future for an earl's daughter who had already been thoroughly compromised. The space between them seemed to vibrate with tension as old wounds reopened and years of suppressed emotion threatened to overwhelm their careful composure. Alexander took a step closer, then another, until only an arm's length separated them. At this distance, Margaret could smell the subtle fragrance of his cologne, bergamot and sandalwood, masculine and expensive, and see the fine lines that years of responsibility had etched around his eyes. You underestimated me, he said softly, his voice carrying an undertone that made her pulse quicken despite her resolve. You underestimated what that night meant to me, what you meant to me. I was not the calculating rake you believed me to be, Margaret. I was a young man who had found something precious and lost it before I fully understood its value. The confession hung in the air between them, dangerous in its honesty. Margaret felt her carefully constructed defenses wavering under the onslaught of his proximity and the remembered passion that had once consumed them both. It changes nothing, she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. 8 years have passed. We are different people now, with different lives, different responsibilities. Alexander's hand rose as if to touch her face, then stopped mere inches from her cheek. Are we so different? When I look at you, I see the same fire that drew me across a crowded ballroom, the same spirit that challenged me to be better than my birthright demanded. 8 years have made you stronger, more beautiful, more worthy of admiration, but the essence of what you are, what we were together, remains unchanged. The sound of the front door opening and Thomas's voice calling for his mother shattered the intimate moment like glass breaking on stone. Margaret stepped back quickly, smoothing her skirts and attempting to restore her composure as small footsteps thundered up the stairs. The child burst into the drawing room with the boundless energy of youth, dirt on his knees and excitement shining in his gray eyes, eyes that were heartbreakingly familiar to the man who watched him with growing wonder. Thomas entered the drawing room with the unconscious confidence of a child secure in his mother's love, yet he stopped short upon seeing the imposing stranger who dominated the modest space. For a moment, mother, father, and son formed a tableau that spoke to deeper truths than words could convey, 3 lives irrevocably connected by blood and circumstance, yet separated by years of deception and social impossibility. Mama, Thomas said, his voice carrying the slight uncertainty that children display when confronted with unfamiliar adult authority, Mrs. Hartwell said we have a visitor from London. His gaze fixed upon Alexander with the frank curiosity of youth, taking in the expensive clothing, the aristocratic bearing, the unmistakable air of power that marked him as different from their usual country acquaintances. Margaret felt her world teetering on the edge of collapse as she watched her son study his father with growing fascination. "Thomas, this is His Grace, the Duke of Ravensworth," she managed, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "Your Grace, may I present my son, Thomas Thornfield." Alexander stepped forward with the formal grace that had been drilled into him from childhood, offering a slight bow that acknowledged the boy's worth without condescending to his youth. "Master Thornfield," he said gravely, "it is my pleasure to make your acquaintance." Yet even as he spoke the conventional words, his eyes devoured every detail of the child's appearance, the familiar stubborn set of his jaw, the intelligent gleam in gray eyes that mirrored his own, the unconscious straightness of posture that spoke of noble breeding despite rustic upbringing. Thomas executed a creditable bow in return, his manners reflecting his mother's careful instruction in the social graces that marked a gentleman. "Your Grace," he replied with the slight lisp that still occasionally marked his speech, "Mama has told me about dukes and their great responsibilities to England." "Do you truly own castles and command armies?" The innocent question struck Alexander like a blow to the chest. Here was his son, asking about the world that should have been his birthright, the castles and estates that bore the Blackwood name, the ancient responsibilities that would one day have fallen to him as heir to a ducal house. Instead, Thomas lived in modest obscurity, believing himself the son of a dead soldier, denied not only his heritage but even the knowledge of his true identity. "I do indeed own several estates," Alexander replied carefully, his voice gentle in a way Margaret had never heard before. "Ancient castles that have sheltered my family for hundreds of years, lands that stretch beyond the horizon, and yes, I have responsibilities to England that sometimes feel heavier than armor." He paused, studying the boy's rapt attention. "But tell me, what do you know of soldiers? Your mother mentioned your father was a military man." Thomas's face lit with the hero worship typical of boys his age when discussing warfare and adventure. "Papa was the bravest soldier in Wellington's army," he declared proudly. "He died fighting Napoleon at Waterloo, saving England from tyranny. Mama says he was awarded a medal for valor, though she keeps it locked away because it makes her too sad to look upon it." The fictional medal, Margaret's cheeks burned with shame at the elaborate deception she had constructed, yet she could not regret protecting her son from the harsh realities of his conception. She watched Alexander's face as Thomas spoke, saw the muscle that tightened in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The Duke was learning what it meant to be erased from his own child's life, replaced by a phantom hero who could never disappoint or abandon. "A medal for valor," Alexander repeated slowly, his eyes meeting Margaret's over Thomas's head. The look that passed between them carried layers of meaning, accusation, understanding, grief for what might have been, and something deeper that neither dared acknowledge. "Your father sounds like a remarkable man, one worthy of your pride and your mother's devotion." The irony was not lost on Margaret, who had indeed awarded Alexander a kind of posthumous medal in their son's mind, transforming a night of passion between two young people into a grand romance between a nobleman and a soldier's daughter, creating a love story that justified Thomas's existence without shame or stigma. Yet hearing Alexander acknowledge the fiction with such grace made her throat tight with unshed tears. Thomas moved closer to the Duke with the fearless curiosity of childhood, his small hand reaching out to touch the sapphire pin in Alexander's cravat. "Is that a real jewel, Your Grace? Mama has a necklace with blue stones, but she only wears it on special occasions." The innocent observation made both adults freeze. Margaret's sapphire necklace had been Alexander's gift on the morning after their night together, hastily given as he prepared to leave for his father's summons about the arranged engagement. Alexander's breath caught in his throat as memory crashed over him like a cold wave. The necklace, he had chosen it himself from the finest jeweler in Bond Street, sapphires the color of midnight to match her eyes when passion darkened them. He had fastened it around her neck with trembling fingers, pressing kisses to her throat as she laughed with the joy of a woman thoroughly loved. The idea that she had kept it, treasured it enough to preserve it through years of exile and financial difficulty, shook him to his core. "Blue stones can be very precious," Alexander managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "Perhaps your mother will tell you the story of her necklace someday, when you are older and can understand such things." His eyes found Margaret's again, and this time the challenge was unmistakable. How long would she continue the deception? How long would she deny their son his true heritage? Margaret felt the walls closing in around the life she had built so carefully. Thomas's innocent questions, Alexander's presence, the weight of years of lies, all of it pressed upon her like a physical force. "Thomas," she said quietly, struggling to keep her voice level, "why don't you ask Mrs. Hartwell to prepare tea for our guest? I'm sure His Grace would appreciate some refreshment after his long journey." The boy nodded eagerly, thrilled to play host to such an important visitor. "Yes, Mama. Your Grace, Mrs. Hartwell makes the finest seed cakes in Yorkshire. Papa would have been honored to have a duke taste them." With that declaration, he bounded from the room with all the energy of youth, leaving his parents alone in a silence that thrummed with tension and unspoken truths. Alexander turned on Margaret the moment Thomas's footsteps faded, his composure finally cracking under the weight of discovery and denial. "A medal for valor," he demanded, his voice low but fierce. "You turn me into a dead war hero rather than tell him the truth of his birth? You gave him a phantom father to worship rather than a living one who could love him?" Margaret's own composure shattered like crystal striking stone. "Love him?" she cried, her voice breaking with years of suppressed pain. "The way you loved me? With pretty words and passionate nights followed by engagement announcements in the morning papers? Forgive me if I found fiction preferable to that particular truth." The accusation hung between them like a sword, sharp and unforgiving. Alexander ran his hands through his dark hair, destroying the careful arrangement that spoke of hours spent with a valet. "Margaret, please. You must understand, I had no choice in that engagement. My father threatened to cut me off completely, to strip me of everything that would allow me to support a wife and family. I fought him, raged against it, but I was 23 years old and dependent on his goodwill." Margaret's laugh held no warmth, only the bitter edge of a woman who had learned hard truths about the world and her place in it. "And I was 17 and utterly dependent on yours. The difference is that I chose to build a life for our son rather than sacrifice him to ducal duty and social expectation." She moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where Thomas's toy soldiers still lay scattered on the grass. "He has been happy here, Alexander. Safe and loved and free from the whispers that would have followed him in London society. Can you say the same of the life he would have had as your acknowledged bastard?" The tea service arrived with precise English timing, Mrs. Hartwell's silver tray bearing delicate Wedgwood china that had been Margaret's one concession to luxury in her modest household. Thomas followed the housekeeper with barely contained excitement, his small chest puffed with importance at entertaining such an exalted guest. The domestic ritual provided a necessary buffer against the emotional storm that had been building between his parents, though the underlying tensions remained as sharp as unsheathed blades. Alexander accepted his teacup with the automatic grace of a man who had performed this ritual thousands of times in drawing rooms across England, yet his attention remained fixed upon Thomas with an intensity that made Margaret's pulse quicken with alarm. She watched as her son unconsciously mimicked the Duke's movements, the way he held his teacup, the slight tilt of his head when listening, the unconscious straightening of his shoulders when addressed directly. The resemblance was becoming more pronounced by the hour, as if proximity to his father awakened dormant traits that no amount of rustic upbringing could suppress. "Tell me about your studies, young man," Alexander said, his voice carrying genuine interest rather than polite adult conversation. Your mother mentioned that you show particular aptitude for languages and mathematics. The Duke's scholarly interests had been well known in university circles. He had taken first honors at Oxford and maintained correspondence with leading mathematicians and natural philosophers across Europe. Thomas's face brightened with the enthusiasm of a child whose intellectual gifts were finally being recognized by someone who could appreciate them. I can read Latin as well as English, Your Grace, and Mama has taught me French conversation. She says a gentleman must be able to converse with diplomats and foreign dignitaries. He paused, then added with 8-year-old pride, I've also been studying the campaigns of Caesar and Alexander the Great. Military strategy is fascinating. The mention of military strategy sent a chill through Margaret as she recognized another inherited trait manifesting itself. The Blackwoods had produced generals and admirals for centuries, men who possessed an instinctive understanding of tactics and leadership. Her father-in-law's fictional heroic death had inadvertently aligned with Thomas's natural inclinations, creating a perfect storm of irony that threatened to expose everything she had worked to conceal. Alexander leaned forward in his chair, his gray eyes alight with genuine paternal pride. Caesar's commentaries are excellent preparation for understanding grand strategy, he agreed seriously. Have you considered how his use of engineering and siegecraft demonstrated the importance of logistics in military campaigns? The question was sophisticated enough to challenge an adult mind, yet posed with the respect one accorded an intellectual equal. Margaret watched in growing amazement as her son rose to meet the Duke's intellectual challenge. Thomas's response revealed not only his quick wit but the depth of understanding that comes from natural ability combined with excellent tutoring. The conversation that developed between father and son was a revelation. Here was Alexander not as the distant aristocrat or passionate lover she had known, but as the thoughtful scholar and natural teacher he might have been under different circumstances. Your Grace, Thomas said with sudden solemnity, if you don't mind my asking, have you ever been to war yourself? Mama says that noblemen have duties to defend England, just as Papa did. The innocent question carried dangerous implications, touching as it did upon themes of duty, honor, and the responsibilities that came with noble birth. Alexander's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how to answer honestly without destroying the child's faith in his fictional father. I have been fortunate to serve England in Parliament rather than on the battlefield, he replied carefully. Though I have studied military history extensively and served as an advisor to the War Office on matters of supply and strategy. Your father's service was more direct and far braver than my own contributions to our nation's defense. The generosity of Alexander's response struck Margaret like a physical blow. Here was the man she had once loved, the one whose memory she had both cherished and cursed for 8 years, showing infinite kindness to the son who knew nothing of their connection. He could have used this moment to begin undermining Thomas's faith in his fictional father, could have planted seeds of doubt that would eventually lead to revelation. Instead, he chose to honor the mythology Margaret had created, even as it must have cost him dearly to praise a phantom rival for his own child's affection. Mrs. Hartwell returned to clear the tea things with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had served in great houses before accepting employment in Margaret's modest household. As she worked, her sharp eyes missed nothing, not the tension that vibrated between her mistress and the distinguished visitor, nor the growing fascination that young Master Thomas displayed toward the Duke. The housekeeper had served Margaret faithfully for 8 years without once questioning her past or the circumstances that had brought them to Yorkshire. Yet even she could see that this unexpected visit threatened to overturn the careful order of their quiet lives. Your Grace, Thomas said as the tea service disappeared, would you perhaps like to see my collection of military miniatures? Mama bought them for me in York, and I've arranged them to show the Battle of Waterloo just as it was fought. The invitation was extended with the eagerness of a child desperate to impress an adult he admired, yet it carried dangerous implications that made Margaret's blood run cold. Alexander glanced at Margaret, seeking permission with a courtesy that revealed his awareness of the delicate situation. When she nodded reluctantly, he rose from his chair with fluid grace. "I should be honored to see your collection, Thomas. Perhaps you could explain to me how Wellington positioned his forces to achieve victory against seemingly impossible odds." As Thomas led the Duke from the drawing room with barely contained excitement, Margaret remained behind in a state of growing panic. The longer Alexander stayed, the more apparent became the bond developing between father and son, a connection that transcended conscious knowledge and spoke to deeper truths of blood and temperament. Thomas was responding to Alexander with an enthusiasm she had never seen him display toward other adult men, as if some part of him recognized a kinship that logic could not explain. The sound of their voices drifted down from Thomas's nursery, now converted to a young boy's bedroom and study. Alexander's deeper tones mixed with Thomas's excited explanations, creating a harmony that spoke of natural affinity and shared interests. Margaret could hear her son describing his miniature armies with the precision of a natural strategist, while Alexander asked questions that encouraged deeper analysis and critical thinking. When they returned to the drawing room nearly an hour later, both were animated by their discussion. Thomas's cheeks were flushed with excitement at having found an adult who could match his intellectual curiosity, while Alexander wore an expression of wonder that he struggled to conceal. The transformation in both of them was remarkable, the reserved Duke revealed as a man capable of genuine warmth and enthusiasm, while Thomas displayed depths of character that his mother was only beginning to recognize. "Mama," Thomas announced breathlessly, "His Grace has promised to send me books about military engineering and fortification design. Real books written by actual generals and engineers." The prospect of such treasures clearly overwhelmed the child, who had been limited to the modest selection available in their country neighborhood. Margaret felt her carefully constructed world shifting beneath her feet like sand in a storm. Every kindness Alexander showed Thomas, every moment of connection between them, made the eventual revelation more inevitable and more devastating. How could she explain to her son that the man he had come to admire in a single afternoon was actually his father, the one she had declared dead to preserve their peaceful anonymity? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pemberton Manor as the moment of truth approached with inexorable certainty. Margaret stood at the threshold of her carefully ordered life, knowing that whatever decision she made in the next few minutes would alter forever the destiny of everyone she held dear. The weight of 8 years of deception pressed upon her shoulders like a physical burden, while the growing bond between Alexander and Thomas made continued silence increasingly impossible. Alexander had excused himself to speak privately with his coachman, ostensibly to arrange accommodations for the night in a village inn, but Margaret suspected he was giving her time to prepare for the conversation they both knew must come. Through the window, she could see Thomas in the garden, moving his wooden soldiers with renewed enthusiasm after his afternoon with the Duke. The child's excitement was palpable. For the first time in his young life, he had found an adult who could match his intellectual curiosity and challenge his developing mind. When Alexander returned to the drawing room, his expression had settled into the mask of aristocratic composure that served him in the most challenging political situations. Yet Margaret could see beneath the surface to the man who had spent the afternoon discovering his son's remarkable character and potential. The knowledge of what he was being denied, the right to know and guide his own child, burned in his gray eyes like barely controlled fire. "We cannot continue this charade indefinitely," Alexander said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Thomas is too intelligent, too perceptive to be deceived much longer. Already he senses something significant about my visit, even if he cannot name it. Children possess an instinct for truth that adult sophistication often destroys." Margaret moved to her escritoire, her hands trembling as she retrieved a small mahogany box that had remained hidden in the secret drawer for 8 years. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, lay the sapphire necklace Alexander had given her on that long-ago morning, the last gift from the last moment when they had been simply two young people in love, before duty and circumstance tore them apart. The jewels caught the afternoon light, still as brilliant as the day he had fastened them around her throat with such tender care. "I have thought of this moment every day for 8 years," she admitted quietly, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated sorrow and regret. "I have imagined 100 different scenarios, 1,000 different outcomes, yet I never found a solution that would not cause more pain than the original deception." She held the necklace up to the light, watching the sapphires fragment the sunshine into blue fire. "How do I tell him that everything he believes about himself is a lie? How do I explain that I stole from him not only his father but his entire heritage, his birthright, his place in the world?" Alexander stepped closer, his presence both comforting and disturbing in its familiarity. "You tell him the truth, Margaret. You tell him that sometimes young people make choices that seem right at the time but prove to have unexpected consequences. You tell him that love can exist even when circumstances make it impossible to acknowledge, and that some secrets are kept not from shame but from the desire to protect those we cherish most." The sound of approaching footsteps warned them of Thomas's return, but this time Margaret did not step away from Alexander's proximity. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and prepared to face the most difficult conversation of her life. When her son entered the drawing room, grass stains on his knees and dirt under his fingernails from arranging his toy armies, she saw not just the child she had raised in isolation but the young nobleman he was destined to become. "Thomas," she said gently, "please sit down. His Grace and I have something very important to tell you." The formality of her tone caught the child's attention immediately, his gray eyes, so heartbreakingly similar to his father's, focusing on her face with sudden intensity. Alexander moved to stand beside Margaret's chair, not touching but close enough that his support was unmistakable. His presence lent her strength as she prepared to dismantle 8 years of careful construction with words that would change everything. "My darling boy," she began, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart, "there are things about your family, about your father, that I have not told you because I wanted to protect you from pain and confusion." Thomas's expression grew serious beyond his years, the natural intelligence that marked him responding to the gravity of the moment. "Mama," he said quietly, "is this about why His Grace looks at me the way Papa might have? And why you look so sad when you think I'm not watching?" The perceptiveness of the question took both adults by surprise. Here was proof that Alexander had been right. Children possessed an instinct for truth that could not be indefinitely deceived. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized that her son had been living with unspoken questions, sensing undercurrents he could not understand but accepting them with the faith children place in their parents. "Your father," Margaret said carefully, "was not exactly the man I told you he was. He was indeed brave and honorable, intelligent and kind, but he was not a soldier who died at Waterloo." She paused, gathering courage for the revelation that would change everything. "Your father is very much alive, Thomas. He stands before you now." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of birds in the garden beyond. Thomas's gaze moved slowly from his mother to Alexander, his young mind working to process information that challenged everything he had believed about himself and his origins. Margaret watched her son's face, seeing intelligence war with confusion, hurt struggle against understanding. Alexander knelt before the boy, bringing himself to Thomas's eye level with the instinctive understanding of a man who remembered what it felt like to be small and overwhelmed by adult revelations. "I am your father, Thomas," he said simply, his voice gentle but clear. "I didn't know about you for 8 years because your mother thought it would be safer for you to grow up away from my world. She was probably right. The life of a duke's son, especially one born outside marriage, would have been complicated and sometimes painful." Thomas studied Alexander's face with the intensity of a scholar examining a precious manuscript. "You're really my papa?" he asked quietly. "Not the soldier who died fighting Napoleon, but you, the duke who owns castles and knows about military strategy?" The questions came with a child's directness, cutting through adult complications to reach the essential truth. "I am," Alexander confirmed, and Margaret heard in his voice a wonder that matched her son's. "I wish I had known about you from the beginning, Thomas. I wish I could have been there to see you take your first steps, to hear your first words, to answer all those questions about Caesar and Alexander the Great." His voice roughened with emotion he could no longer suppress. "I have missed 8 years of your life, and I can never get them back, but if you're willing, I would very much like to be part of the years that remain." The offer hung in the air between them, momentous in its implications. Thomas looked to his mother, seeking guidance in a situation that challenged everything he had understood about their quiet life in Yorkshire. Margaret nodded encouragingly, though her heart raced with the implications of what acceptance would mean for their carefully ordered existence. "Will I have to leave Mama?" Thomas asked, the question revealing his deepest fear. "Will I have to go live in castles and learn to be a duke instead of staying here where I'm happy?" The child's priorities were touchingly clear: security and love mattered more than wealth or position, a testament to the values Margaret had instilled during their years of exile. Alexander's expression softened with understanding and respect for the bond between mother and son. "You could never be separated from your mother," he said firmly. "She is the most important person in your world, just as you are in hers. Whatever arrangements we make for the future, they will honor that bond above all else." He glanced at Margaret, his eyes holding a question and a promise. "I hope that your mother might consider allowing both of you to share my life, not just as the mother of my son but as the woman I never stopped loving." The declaration hung in the air like a challenge to fate itself. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat as Alexander's words reframed everything she had believed about their past and future. Here was not just an acknowledgement of Thomas's parentage but an invitation to rebuild what had been destroyed by youth, misunderstanding, and the rigid expectations of society. Thomas's face brightened with the adaptability of childhood. "You mean we could all be a family? Like other families, but with castles?" The innocent question brought laughter from both adults, breaking some of the tension that had filled the room like a physical presence. "Exactly like that," Alexander confirmed, his smile transforming his aristocratic features into something warm and approachable. "A family with castles, extensive libraries, the finest tutors in England, and all the toy soldiers your heart could desire." He paused, then added more seriously, "But most importantly, a family built on love and honesty, where no one ever has to pretend to be something they're not." Margaret felt the last of her resistance crumble as she watched father and son smile at each other with dawning recognition and affection. The future Alexander offered was not without complications. There would be scandal, whispered conversations, the challenge of establishing Thomas's place in a society that valued legitimacy above all else. Yet for the first time in 8 years, she allowed herself to imagine a life where love might triumph over convention, where her son could claim his heritage without shame, where she herself might find happiness instead of mere survival. "There will be conditions," she said firmly, asserting her rights as Thomas's mother and a woman who had sacrificed everything for his well-being. "Thomas's education and upbringing will remain primarily in my hands. His happiness and security will take precedence over social expectations or ducal duty. And I will not be rushed into decisions that affect our future. We have lived quietly for 8 years, and any changes must be made with careful consideration for everyone involved." Alexander nodded gravely, recognizing the wisdom of her demands and the strength that had enabled her to survive and thrive despite impossible circumstances. "Your conditions are entirely reasonable," he agreed. "I would expect nothing less from the woman who raised such a remarkable son under such challenging circumstances." His voice carried a note of admiration that spoke to genuine respect rather than mere politeness. As the afternoon faded into evening, the three of them sat together in Margaret's modest drawing-room, talking quietly about the future they might build together. Thomas peppered his father with questions about dukedoms and estates, while Alexander marveled at the child's quick wit and generous spirit. Margaret watched them both, still hardly daring to believe that the nightmare of separation might truly be ending, that the love she had thought destroyed might yet find new life in more mature hearts. The sapphire necklace lay forgotten on the table between them, its blue fire catching the last rays of sunlight through the Georgian windows. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations with lawyers and family members, the complex process of legitimizing Thomas's position and integrating him into a world he had never known. Yet tonight, for the first time in 8 years, Margaret allowed herself to hope that love might indeed conquer all, even the rigid conventions of English society and the pride that had kept them apart for far too long. Outside, the Yorkshire countryside settled into peaceful twilight, while inside Pemberton Manor, a family began the delicate process of learning to be whole again. The future stretched before them uncertain but bright with possibility, built not on the passion of youth but on the deeper foundation of shared love for the remarkable child who had brought them back together and the mature understanding of what it truly meant to choose love over duty, hope over fear, and truth over the comfortable lies that had sustained them through years of necessary separation. The story of Lady Margaret Wyndham and Alexander Blackwood, 5th Duke of Ravensworth, was far from over. Indeed, it was only just beginning. But this time, they would write it together, guided by wisdom earned through suffering and a love that had proven stronger than 8 years of silence, separation, and the cruel demands of a society that valued appearance over truth. In the gathering dusk of a Yorkshire evening, 3 hearts that had been kept apart by circumstance and misunderstanding finally found their way home to each other, proving that some bonds are too strong to break and some loves too deep to die.